Now hear the word of the Lord from Luke 10:38 through 42. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, Sojourn. Peace be with you. My name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. It's good to see you here this morning. I said it in the first service, but it's first week, New Albany, Floyd County Schools. Congratulations, you made it through another summer. I'm talking to the parents, of course. Back in action here, but we're glad you're here. Could have been anywhere else today. Lots of other places, but you chose to be here, so thank you. At Sojourn, our mission, while we do what we do, is we want to reach people with the gospel. That's the good news of who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, and what Jesus promised he's going to do. We want to build you up in the church, to edify you, encourage you, to equip you as God's people, and send you out into the world as people of truth, beauty, and goodness, in hopes that you will reach people with the gospel. And we can build them up in the church, right? So speaking of building up in the church and edification, this Wednesday night we have a member meeting, but we're more calling this one a family meal for the members of our church, and I believe members in process as well. But if you're interested in becoming a member, our next round of classes begins September 13th, so that's still a few weeks away, but there's going to be more details for that in the future. But this Wednesday, which is the 7th of August, we will gather as a church family at 6 p.m. That's because we're going to have some food prepared by one of our members, so you know it's going to be good. It's going to be a night of joy, fellowship, and encouragement. We don't have an agenda or any big announcements. We just want to spend some time together as a family, sweet time together. I mean, that's what life's about, sweet time with family and friends and free food. That's why I live, right? Good people, good free food. But you'll need to RSVP to the link that's going to be in the email last week. You know what? I'm just going to stop here. There's a link somewhere in an email somewhere where you can RSVP. If you don't trust that, or I did a bad job, you can fill out a Connect card and put it in the giving bucket when it goes around later on. I limit myself to one announcement, and I'm done. So now we'll move on. So we are in a sermon series right now. I think this is the last Sunday, but again, I don't know a whole lot. So I think it's the last Sunday, but it's called God Drew Near, and each preacher, it's been a different preacher every week, and we're talking about how God drew near to us in a passage that relates to that, or how God drew near to us through a passage. So to get started here this morning, obviously the story that I'm going to speak from was read, Jesus in the home of Mary and Martha. So before I get going, I'm going to alliterate. I got a disclaimer and a declaration, okay? And here's the disclaimer. I am going to preach this sermon from the context of my story and how God drew near to me and changed me through this passage. I cannot do justice to the historical, contextual reality of what's actually happening in this passage. The Gospel of Luke is different from the other Gospels in that it focuses on a couple of things, particularly women, particularly the way that how we relate within the kingdom of God, and it's a beautiful, powerful message of what's actually happening in this story. I can't do justice to that because I'm speaking as how God drew near to me through it. I just want to give that disclaimer. Don't give me angry emails or phone calls, or don't be angry with me after the service, please, because I don't do well when I'm put on the spot like that. You'll make me cry is what I'm trying to say. Another disclaimer is actually regarding the passage. This is not a passage about personalities. Because if you read it, if you listen to it read, you might be like, I'm a little bit more type A, kind of like Martha, or I'm type B like Mary, or maybe your Enneagram, if you even know what that is. Maybe that was coming out like, oh, that person's a 4. Or if you don't know what that is, just laugh anyways. It's a personality test. But like, this is not about personality, so we're not going to read this as like, yeah, I'm more like this person than that person. That's not the point of this passage. And so that was the disclaimer, which is going to move me into the declaration. And we're going to do the declaration together. So everybody raise your hand. Get your hand up. I know most of you, I know 25% of you by name, and I will call you by your name if you're not raising your hand. Okay. Repeat after me. I am Martha. On the count of 3, we're going to say all that together emphatically. So I'm going to say, I am Martha. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I am Martha. Okay, thank you. That's the declaration. So there's no question. We're all on common ground. We're Martha. So normally when I preach, I have a couple of 2 or 3 points, and each point is going to be like a command or something you can do. I'm not doing that today. It's a little bit different because I'm sharing a lot of my own life. So it's going to be more like 3 movements. I'm going to invite you into these movements. The first is going to be an invitation into this story of Mary and Martha. The second will be an invitation into my own story. And the third will be an invitation into your story and how it relates here. And there might be a surprise 4th invitation if I'm feeling up for it, which I'm feeling pretty good, so get ready. So I'm going to invite you into this story in Luke chapter 10. Jesus is on the road. His ministry is gaining a lot of traction, and so this is what we read beginning in verse 38. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. So before we start attacking Martha and making her the bad person here, or before like the Martha guilt in our life just starts to sink in real deep, I do want to acknowledge she's doing a good and honorable thing. Jesus is coming into her house, and she's making Jesus feel at home. She's welcoming Jesus. She's serving Jesus. It's a good and noble thing that she's doing. And then we read further on, it says she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. So if we just stop the story here, I don't think it would make much sense. But if we stop the story here, it kind of sounds nice. You have Martha opens her home to Jesus, makes him feel welcome, and Mary sat at his feet and listened to him while he taught. It kind of sounds like a nice Sunday afternoon, right? Maybe what some of you are going to in the next couple hours. I mean, it sounds beautiful, but we have to acknowledge there's so much more going on in this story than that. So let's look at Mary first. Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to him teach. Look, there's no modern day comparison that I could think of that makes sense here. You know, you might be thinking like, well, while Martha was off doing all the chores and doing all the hard work, Mary was just being lazy, sitting on the couch with her homies watching the football game. You know what I mean? Like, you can almost read it that way, because you can be like, my husband does the same thing every time people come over, right? That's how you might want to approach this. Not what's happening. Does not correlate. Because Mary's not being neglectful. She's not being lazy. She is socially aware, and she's actually being intentional about what she's doing. All right? But I will say this about Mary. What she is doing is culturally out of place for her. In that culture, she was out of place with what she was doing. Martha, on the other hand, was doing what would have been expected of her. She was culturally in her place. In that culture, as in some cultures still today, women, their role was to tend to all the preparations and serving of guests in the home. And that's what Martha was doing. And she was going full steam from what we can gather. Mary's place as the younger sister would have been to assist or help her big sister in all the preparations and serving. But I want to point out that not only was Mary culturally out of place, not doing what she was supposed to be doing at that time, she was actually doing something that men would have done in that culture. When a rabbi entered the home, men, while the women tended to the preparations and serving, men would have sat at the rabbi's feet while he taught. And then we get to verse 40, when it says, Martha was distracted with much serving, or some one translation says she was overwhelmed with all the preparations. I don't want us to get lost here with what it was that was distracting Martha. The list of chores that she had, or the bread that she was baking, or the table she was... none of that is not what we're talking about. It's not what was distracting her. What we're going to see is it was more about what was she being distracted from. Martha seems to have lost some focus. While Mary, sitting at the feet of Jesus, was culturally out of place, you would think the story would really want to show how she was out of place, but rather the story begins to zero in on the fact that while Martha was actually doing what was expected of her, while she was culturally in place, it was actually what was stirring in Martha's soul that was out of place. And she was so disturbed, and her soul was so upset and out of place in the situation that she abruptly confronts Jesus. Now, I just want you to use your imagination for just a second. Think about that. Jesus, this is not just a normal guest in your home. It's Jesus. Now, she calls him Lord. So she acknowledges he's not just, you know, I don't know if you know this, but Mary and Martha, their brother's name was Lazarus, who died and was resurrected by Jesus. It's not like Jesus is just, you know, the homeboy of Lazarus. She calls him Lord. Can you imagine the bits of gold and diamond of wisdom and truth oozing from Jesus' mouth while he taught? And Martha was so disturbed that she interrupts Jesus. She comes, I'm not known as a person who's extremely expressive, either in face or tone or any other place in my life, but you can imagine how expressive she would have been to come in and just, hey, Jesus. This is intense. Now, I encourage you, and maybe an assignment is to go read John chapter 11 when Lazarus dies and Jesus is late. He gets there 3 days later, and watch what Martha and Mary do and how they relate to Jesus. It's eerily similar to this situation. So this is not out of character for Martha to do this. But listen to what she says. She says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me. Get past myself for a second. Just imagine the attitude that took for her to say that to Jesus. Notice that she doesn't address Mary. She doesn't say anything to Mary. She goes straight to Jesus. She tells Jesus how it should be. She tells Jesus what's out of place, and she tells Jesus that, Jesus, you need to fix this. I want that to sink in, because that should sound familiar to you. You know why? Because every one of us do this. So often we tell Jesus, here's what's wrong, here's what's out of place, and here's how I think you should fix it, Jesus. We are Martha. We are beginning to see that the real conflict of this story is not Mary and what she was doing. And the real conflict is not that Martha was doing what she was expected to do. The conflict is what's stirring inside of Martha's soul. And that's what Jesus speaks to. He responds, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Jesus is always gentle and sharp with his words. He doesn't speak to whatever chores Martha has. He doesn't speak to whatever the cultural expectations might have been. Jesus knows what's out of place in the situation, and he speaks directly to it. You are anxious and troubled. And I want you to notice he's very nice in how he says it. But basically what he says is, no, Martha, I will not tell Mary to get up and help you, because she's right where she needs to be. See, Jesus has a way of revealing to us what is out of place in our life. And it's always followed by Jesus inviting us to a place that's better. I'll repeat that. Jesus has a way of revealing to us what's out of place in our life, and then he proceeds to invite us into a place that's better for us. So now I invite you to my own story. In 1998, I just found out that in the first service I said 1988, but in 1998 I was 15. The math should add up to be I'm 41 today. But in 1998, I was 15. I was no longer playing sports, which was a big deal for me. I'd grown up playing sports. I loved them, and I quit playing. And I was kind of lost, like a little puppy. I didn't know what to do. I guess that's what most 15-year-olds feel like. But I went to church camp at the end of the summer. And I'd been to church camp before, but this one was a little off for me because I didn't want to be there. My best friend had dropped out at the last second because he was going to go play in a baseball tournament, right? He's going off playing the sports while I'm going to do this church camp. I can't really put my finger on what happened at that church camp. But I do know that the Lord did a good work in my life there. And if you knew me before that and you knew me after that, you knew there was a big difference in my life. But all the energy that I had poured into sports had now been deflected, as it is with all of us. It was now deflected into leading my youth group at church. I deflected energy from sports into leading my youth group at church. And I loved it. And in the year 2000, which would have been 2 years later, on October 28th, I was at a Third Day concert. Yeah? Third Day. They're a contemporary, not so contemporary anymore, but they're a contemporary Christian rock band. They're still playing today, which I think is quite impressive. But I would say the pinnacle of their career was really the late 90s, early 2000s. But I was at a Third Day concert, and at that concert, I felt like the Lord called me to full-time Christian ministry. I was 17. It was a big deal. It was powerful. It was emotional. The next day, the 29th, would have been a Sunday, and I went to a church that had invitations where you were invited down the aisle. I walked down the aisle. I grabbed the pastor, and I told him, the Lord has called me to full-time Christian ministry. The church made a huge deal. Lots of tears, lots of hugs, lots of lipstick on my cheeks. It was a big deal. I graduated high school, went to Western Kentucky University, and in between my freshman and sophomore year of college, that church hired me as a part-time youth minister. At 19 years old, I was getting paid to do ministry. Pretty cool. I was 19. I was leading people like 1 or 2 years younger than me, but it was a great opportunity. A couple years later, the camp that I grew up going to, I got hired to work on staff as a camp counselor or a Bible study leader. So every summer I got to go somewhere and teach hundreds of kids about Jesus and Bible studies, and I got to play basketball and softball and all kinds of stuff. A couple years after that, this camp hired me as a camp pastor, which is a big deal. I was a spiritual leader. If you're listening to this, I'm doing air quotes right now, but I was a spiritual leader of the staff, whatever that meant. But it also meant that I got to preach to hundreds of students 5 nights a week, which equated to thousands of students every summer. I got to preach to them. And I did that for multiple summers. My last year of college, I became the associate pastor of a small church in Bowling Green, Kentucky. There are members of this church who were there with me 20 years ago, however long that was. It was a wonderful experience. I got to see the college ministry go from 4 college students to 30 college students. We filled up 3 rows of pews. If you don't know what a pew is, it's basically a bunch of chairs glued together and you can't see the seams, right? But it was it was amazing, like 30 college students. I saw the Lord do some great things there. Just so I mentioned this, it was an unpaid position. I didn't get paid for it, but my name was on the website, so it was official. After I graduated, I did what was expected of me in full-time Christian ministry. I went to seminary across the river in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, seminary for me was one of the most depressing times of my life. Like, not just depressing, I struggled with depression. I was very lonely. It took me 4 years, and this was not the seminary's fault that I was how I was. I made choices that led to that, but the point is, it was tough for me, but I persevered I endured, and I got my Master's of Divinity. So you are sitting there today looking at someone who's Master of the Divine, right? That's what that means. I felt like seminary did a great job in training me in the Bible and theology, but it didn't do a good job in training me how to love people or be a pastor. So I turned down a couple job offers because I wanted to stay and I wanted to be invested in by pastors at Sojourn. I was a member of Sojourn at that time. And I remember praying. It's like, Lord, I'm staying here, and I want a pastor to invest in me. And the Lord answered my prayer. A couple of months later, Chad Lewis began to invest in me. And if you know anything about the history of Sojourn, if there's one pastor you want to invest in you about how to love and care for people, it was Chad. And so I had that going for me. I did all the leadership training, all the counseling training, all the preaching seminars. I mean, I did everything that was required of me. And you know what it led to? It led to me being here on staff full-time at Sojourn, New Albany, when the church began. And at a certain point, there was a leadership change. Pastor Michael was the original pastor here. He left, and Pastor Jonah came in. And Pastor Jonah is still here today, faithfully leading this church. Jonah's a good friend of mine. But through all that, I kind of got to a place where I on staff here where I didn't quite know what my place was. So Jonah and I we talked about it. And it came down to where we said there's really two ways forward. And me and Jonah could work together and help me find a church out there to pastor and love and care for and lead. Or I could stay here and find a job outside of the church. And I am someone who is high-strung with fear. So maybe it was fear, or maybe it was stubbornness that I disguised as loyalty. Whatever it was, I chose to stay here and get a job outside the church. See, the thing is I really felt like the Lord was up to something here. And I didn't want to leave it. I wanted to stay. I wanted to see what he was doing, and I wanted to be a part of it. Whether it was full-time ministry or not. I want you to hang on to this statement because it comes back. I was staying here because I wanted to see how God was going to change you. I stayed here because I wanted to see how God was going to move in your life. The job search, it didn't go very well for me. It didn't go as planned. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what path to take. Those were some of the toughest, most difficult months of my life. It took me almost a year to find a job. As someone who had been working since the age of 15, you can imagine. My wife was patient and supportive and loving. There's only so much she could do. As you can imagine, I had a lot of time on my hands. So I remember I watched a lot of Matlock. It's not even the good Andy Griffith show. If you don't know what Matlock is, it is Andy Griffith. As he gets older, he has white hair. He's a lawyer who always wins and eats a lot of hot dogs. There's the premise of the show. But yet I watched every episode at 10 o'clock every morning. If you're not laughing because you feel bad for me, you can laugh at that because that's super funny, guys. All right? That's crazy. I joined a gym and went 5 days a week. I worked on a specific muscle group every day. Drank a lot of protein, probably too much, a lot of water. I was pretty muscular, actually. One church member said, I remember that time I called you Sam Buff. My wife called it unemployment body. So I had that. I cooked a lot, which was a good thing. I love to cook, but I had a lot of time on my hands, so it was like meals that took like 5 hours to make. I did that. I got into a phase where I started making jam. My wife has a picture. I'm not going to show it. That's not inappropriate. It's just I'm not going to show it. But I'm standing in the kitchen with a tank top on, and it was like arm day at the gym because I'm like hulking out. But I got a pot in one hand, and I got a wooden spoon in the other, and I'm just making that jam, just stirring away. And I'm just smiling, just a fake smile, like, look at my life, babe, look at my life. It doesn't take a genius to realize that life wasn't going too well for me when the best things I had going for me was unemployment body and some delicious jam. But every day, I remember I would wake up and drink a cup of coffee or two. I'd read my Bible and I would journal my thoughts. And so in preparation for this, I went back and I got all those journals out and I read them. I read all the entries for those months of my life. And, hand on the Bible, it was like I was reading the diary of Martha herself. I was a young man who was very bitter, confused, anxious. I was very sad. And if you know anything about men, we typically turn sadness into anger. So I was angry. More than a few times, more than a hint of me telling Jesus what was out of place, what was wrong, and how Jesus should fix it. I remember telling Jesus how I saw it. And it sounded something like this. For 13 years, Jesus, for 13 years, I did what was expected of me. I poured out my sweat and my tears in ministry to you, my whole life and being dedicated to serving you. I had direction, I had vision, I had dreams. My place in the kingdom of God was full-time Christian ministry. That was my place. What am I supposed to do now, Jesus? Where am I supposed to go from here? And it wasn't like Jesus abruptly spoke to me in those months. As a matter of fact, as Jesus typically operates, it was like a slow whisper over the next few years of my life. This is what Jesus said to me in the midst of all of that Martha desperation and anger. He said, Sam, you are anxious and troubled about many things. Have you ever thought about just sitting at my feet? You see, for Martha, Jesus was in her home. She was serving Jesus. But she missed Jesus. And I'm here to tell you that you can have Jesus in your life, doing good and noble things for Jesus, but never experience the presence of Jesus. Never realizing what Jesus actually has to offer you. That whole time I thought that my place in the kingdom of God was in full-time Christian ministry. That was my place. But Jesus met me in this passage, and he showed me that my place in the kingdom of God was at his feet, listening and resting. And as I began to realize that, slowly but surely, I began to experience peace and contentment like I had never experienced before. I began to hear the whispers of Jesus like never before. I look back and Jesus, he wasn't giving me what I wanted. He wasn't giving me what I was demanding of him. But looking back on that time, he was giving me so much more. And I didn't realize it. You know, my wife and I, we stayed here. We continued to serve in the church. We did ministry here. And I wasn't getting paid to do it. And I will tell you that those were some of the most beautiful, impactful, and fruitful ministry experiences of my life. And it wasn't even full-time Christian ministry. So many of my friends up to that point were friends because of ministry. But during those months of difficulty and confusion, my wife and I made deep, impactful friendships with people who had never heard me preach, who never knew me as Sam, the full-time staff guy. They only knew me as Sam, the unemployed who makes good jam. And they were such good friends. When I took my place at the feet of Jesus, God's kingdom took on a whole new life for me. But to be clear, there's no graduation from Martha to Mary. You're always Martha. I'm still a Martha today. Even though it's not full-time, where I don't see my place in the world as full-time Christian ministry, I still have struggles because I still have responsibilities. I have all the expectations and pressures of being a husband and a father and an employee. I'm a volunteer pastor here. And each of those things, while they are good and honorable and noble, they oftentimes cause me deep anxiety and intense pressure and confusion as I just try to make it through life. But because Jesus met me in this passage and drew near to me, I'm able to see it more clearly than I did 10 years ago. When that sense of out-of-placeness wells up in my soul, I can feel it a little more than I used to. And I can hear the voice of Jesus more distinctly, inviting me back to his feet. So I invite you now into your own story. We all raised our hand. You can't get around it. You are Martha. Every one of you can fill in the blank. Whatever that thing was for Martha or whatever that thing was for me, there's something for you that your life is wrapped around. What is it? Can you call it by name? What are you measuring yourself by? What are the expectations and pressures that every day you're trying to live into or trying to live up to, whether it's your own personal expectations or expectations that others have put on you? What is that thing in your life that you're constantly going to Jesus, telling Jesus what's wrong, what's out of place, and how Jesus should fix it? What is that? And you could fill in the blank, and you can say, my place in this world is... And I'll bet that your response to that is probably not an evil or a bad thing. No one is saying, my place in this world is a bank robber. Like, no one's doing that. You're probably not responding to that with a bad or evil thing. It's probably a good and noble thing. Like being a parent, being a spouse, being successful at your career, being a great advocate or activist for whatever that thing is that you care so much about. We all have it. We all have something, and I'm probably not off base when I say that it's probably good and noble, but I'm probably not off base when I say that that thing probably causes confusion and anxiety and pressure in your life. It probably feels overwhelming. But I can tell you that whatever it is that you measure yourself by, whatever the expectations and pressures that you put on yourself, whatever it is in your life that you define yourself by, it will cause you anxiety. It's going to cause you trouble, and it can be taken away from you. Look at Martha and look at my story. It can be taken away from you. Whatever that thing is, listen, at best, whatever that thing is going to disappoint you. At worst, it's going to crush you. But listen to what Jesus said to Martha regarding Mary. Mary has chosen the necessary thing. She has chosen the good portion. And no, Martha, it will not be taken away from her. At my feet, I will never tell somebody to get up and go away. I told you there's a surprise fourth invitation. And here it is. I invite you to take your place at the feet of Jesus, knowing that there's no better place for you to be. There's no safer place for you to be. There's no more peaceful place that you can be. And it is the only place in your life, the only place that will never be taken away from you. If you're not a Christian and you've never put your trust in Jesus, you might be saying to yourself, I guess I'm exempt from this. Oh, to the contrary. You're serving something. Your life is spinning circles around something. You're exerting all your energy and efforts and pressures to something. There is an expectation you're trying to live up to or live into. You're serving a master. But wouldn't you rather have a king of your life who requires you to simply sit at his feet and listen to him and rest? Wouldn't you rather have a king who says to you, come to me, all who are tired and weary and burdened, and I will give you rest? Because Jesus is a king who is not about you doing more, but he is a king who is about inviting you into something more. So Martha, all you Marthas, let us find our place at the feet of Jesus. Let us listen. Let us rest, knowing that it will never be taken away from you. Let's pray.